Tri-City Sports Now, I'm Marky. Billson. On the line with me is Steve Behr, who covers the Appalachian State Mountaineers for the Watauga Democrat. And tomorrow, Appalachian State has a big football game with a familiar opponent, Georgia Southern. Of course, these two teams used to battle for first place in the Southern Conference. Now they're battling for first place in the Sun Belt. But, something I found interesting, there's that Thursday game that ESPN likes to put in college football, I guess, go head-to-head for whatever reason against the NFL Thursday night game. But that's Virginia Tech and Georgia Tech. How do these two teams always play on Thursday? It's not the first time that they've done that. It seems to be an annual tradition. Why are these two teams playing on a Thursday and not the traditional Saturday, Steve Behr?
Well, I guess because ESPNU needs the programming.
Ah.
I don't know. I know they've been longtime rivals. It's been not a good show, but it's unusual to see a group of five game on Thursday trying to go against the NFL. Or you're right. You would expect maybe an SEC or an ACC or even a Big Ten game, but you've got two teams that these are pretty good football teams. They're not exactly bottom feeders, but this is the fourth year in a row that they're going on Thursday night. It's almost like a pre-Thanksgiving tradition that they're building.
Well, this is actually going to be, by the way, in Statesboro, Georgia, not up at Boone and all that. But Boone has been known to be hosting some pretty decent ball games. A couple of years ago, Miami, for old time's sakes and future seasons, UMass and Marshall are going to be coming in. And then in the next decade, North Carolina and South Carolina will be playing in Boone, North Carolina. And I guess, when I look about what the difference is between the Southern Conference and the Sun Belt. Obviously, you can schedule those teams and maybe you can get one to come in. And I guess that makes it all worthwhile for Appalachian State to be having those extra scholarships and playing at a higher level, even though some may lament no longer playing in the playoffs, instead going to the Who Cares Bowl and stuff. But what's different about these programs in the Sun Belt, in your opinion? Yeah, obviously a little deeper.
They're deeper. I was thinking about that the other day. Those FCS 1AA championship games or teams that App State had, and there are several players from those teams that could play on this level. Just a guy like Armani Edwards and Dexter Jackson, several of the offensive linemen. They're easily could play on this team, but it's the depth. You look at a guy like Jalen Moore, who just tore up his foot and his ankle. Well, his replacement comes in and gains 183 yards the next week. So you're right about the depth. There's a lot more depth on this level. The players are a little bigger, a little faster, but there were when App State first got into the Sun Belt. Those teams, 2005, 2007, could have easily beaten the majority of those teams that were in the Sun Belt at the time. And you look at when Georgia Southern and App State came in, Georgia Southern, App State. Georgia Southern wins the league. I guess it wasn't official, but Georgia Southern, had they already done the transition, completed the transition, they're league champs the first time out. Mm-hmm. App State's been tied for the championship last 2 years. Before that, they were second, I believe. Before that, they were third. So, those were good football teams. You had teams like Furman back in those days, 2000s, and Wofford had some good teams back then. Mm-hmm. Those teams could have competed, I think.
But
depth, you lose some key guys, it's going to hurt a lot more than so much now.
But I've said this. Everybody points to the victory against Michigan, but and for that matter, in the '90s, it seemed like the Mountaineers had Wake Forest's number more times than not. But still, I looked at it like in the previous decade, Wyoming routed Appalachian State. 3 years ago, Appalachian State routed Wyoming. I know Wyoming's won-loss record wasn't as good in 2015 as it was in 2004, but even so, we're talking about 68-point difference here. I mean, that has a lot to do not with Cowboys' ineptitude, but the growth of the Mountaineers. And I don't think that the Mountaineers, if they're not in the Sun Belt, are taking Penn State to overtime, or certainly are a kicker shy of beating Tennessee a couple of years ago. Do you?
No. They hit a stretch where they were very, very good. Those were good teams. But you go back to that Wyoming game, the depth played a factor. They lost one defensive end to academics, and then in 2005, he's the one that scoops up the winning touchdown in the championship game, and then he played a little bit with the Packers and the Lions, and and the Broncos and the Raiders. So it's that. Or the guy who replaced him weighed all of 210 pounds for defensive end.
Steve Behr, Watauga Democrat, Lions, oh my. Did you have porridge for breakfast, Mr. Behr?
Oh, I skip breakfast because I prefer to sleep a lot.
I see. Okay.
But I did have a couple of hot dogs, and I'm sure they were loaded with the steroids with all the other stuff.
Anyway, no, you're going to be doing the Dorothy. I had to go with the Goldilocks right there. Hey, number 25 in the country. How high is up for Appalachian State, though? I mean, not just this year. I mean, sure, you can win out, something like that, but maybe, continue the ranking. But I mean, as a program, what do you think the limit is, or the next step is as a program for Appalachian State?
Oh, that's a good question. When they first made the move to the FBS, they really wanted to get into Conference USA. At the time, East Carolina was in that conference. Charlotte was also trying to get into that league, and Conference USA went for population over quality of football teams. They got Texas San Antonio, I think, was a new addition during that stretch. Charlotte was they were adding a football team, so they kept them there, and so the thing is, Conference USA is completely different now. A lot of them went to the American Athletic Conference?
Yes. With Tulane and SMU and Connecticut and all those guys, yes.
Yeah, so I'm sure 5-10 years down the road, you'll probably see some shifting, as you usually do. They will probably like to move into a league like the AAC or something like that. It all kind of depends on will they stay competitive, for one thing?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, I wrote a piece. I do a monologue, Steve Behr, Watauga Democrat, and it's posted on Medium if you want to see it. And I write up every morning, sort of a column that I begin the show with. And I wrote about Appalachian State, and I said, you see Central Florida out here, and they're saying, you can't play for the national championship because you don't play in a strong enough conference. And if the American wanted to improve their football a lot, how would they go about doing it? And they'd have to find the strongest football programs out there. And I said, well, what about Appalachian State? And at that point, then you get what Appalachian State, I know, wanted 10 years ago, which is to be in a two-bid NCAA league. But the one thing that surprised me is you said that Conference USA went population with Charlotte. Isn't Appalachian State in the Charlotte TV market? Isn't that ultimately the big thing, the way it's gerrymandered and such?
Well, that was their argument, was that they were 2 hours away from Charlotte, 3 hours away from Knoxville, 2 hours away from Asheville, about an hour and a half, 2 hours away from Winston-Salem, Greensboro, which is kind of, it's kind of the central part of the state. Greensboro is a fairly good-sized city, about 200,000 plus. Winston's around there, but they said no. I thought it was a big mistake by them. You've got a team. They don't have the population, but that win over Michigan is still paying paying dividends. It's still mentioned when a David goes against the Goliath, especially when they win.
Oh, we heard it all the time against Penn State. Yeah.
And it's mentioned first. It's not, they also did this. I mean, it's the first thing that people think about. And I think that just brings a bunch of eyes, especially national eyes, to your conference when you have a team that's done that. But especially if they can do it again. Boy, they really should have beaten Tennessee. That was a fluke loss. They missed 2 kicks, including a field goal, and Tennessee needed to recover a fumble after the Tennessee quarterback was almost decapitated at the goal line, and the fumble was in the end zone. And that's the way the ball bounces. But ifs and buts, I guess. But that's how competitive they were. Tennessee was number 7 in the country at the time.
I was reading, I'm sorry, Steve Behr. I was reading, forgive me for interrupting here, but the game preview in App State Mania, as well as your column about how this game is still a rivalry game for Appalachian State, Georgia Southern and such. I guess that leads to my next question is, for the people in Johnson City and such, is ETSU still a rival for Appalachian State, or are those days as long gone as, I don't know, Tulane, LSU?
East Tennessee State, you mean?
Yeah.
No, they're not. They haven't played it so long. ETSU, stopped their program, I think, in 2005, and they just brought it back, I think, 2013. And they've long since, they haven't played since 2005. Now, they do have a game scheduled coming up. I can't remember exactly what year it is. But, no, Georgia Southern was big rival at the start. And the main reason was when you're playing for the same prize, you want
Sure.
it more than they do, you're going to have to bring it. And that's what they both always used to do. And those were terrific football games. First one I saw was 99. And it was Georgia Southern was number 1 in the country at the time for 1AA, and geez, they just got after it, and it's a fun game to watch. I've had 2 or 3 App State players just say we don't like them, they don't like us.
Yeah, I noticed Duck, the defensive back, who's have such a great reputation, talking about that in your story and such. Clifton Duck. And, you can feel it, he said, and such. And so I found that very intriguing that, even they've gone, both of them from the old conference to the new one, but the hate is still there. Why not? They're still playing for first place. But I do ask this, since these schools have grown up, so to speak, 85 scholarships, Sun Belt Conference, Georgia Southern still running that option. Okay, I can still see that at the Citadel. I can still see that at Army. I can still see that at even a place like Wofford. But, there was an article in Sports Illustrated talking about how obsolete this offense is. Can Georgia Southern continue to play at this level and run the option in the future and continue to win? Or is this 6-1 a fluke, or the 2 losing seasons of last 2 years more where that option at a higher level fits in?
Well, I think a lot of with the option is surprise. You just don't get a lot of time to prepare for it. And so many teams run the spread.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Georgia Southern was kind of drifting towards. They were running a more passing offense before, and now they're kind of going back to their roots, and they've always had success running that option. So I think they'll go with it until it doesn't work, and then they'll find a coach that'll bring something else in. But I remember when they were in the Southern Conference and Paul Johnson left, and I believe he went to Navy and had success. I think his name was Chris Hatcher, brought in a spread offense, and it just failed miserably. And they had to kind of regroup and go back to an option spread hybrid. I don't know exactly what it was. Mm-hmm. But, it took them a while to kind of get used to going back where they were. This team has always been very successful with that option. The thing I really like about it, at least the way Georgia Southern used to run it in the old days, it was very quarterback is critical. He's got to make the right read. You got to hang on to the ball. But it's a lot easier to pick up a 3rd and 3 than it is to pick up a 3rd and 13.
Well, you mentioned, and certainly on 3rd and 3, if you get 2, depending on your field position, you may want to go for it on 4th and 1, and that would seem to be an easy pickup too. But Scott Sloan, let me change the gears a little bit here. He's defensive coordinator at Georgia Southern, used to be an assistant at Appalachian State. Is that an advantage? How big of an advantage do you think that is for the Eagles, if at all?
Well, I think it's an advantage, but I don't think it's a game breaker. He knows the personnel. He knows he's faced that offense for a long time, both in practice and all that. So, it'll give them. I think they'll know, like, this guard can block this, or maybe they'll like this receiver. But the thing is about App State is that that's a young football team. It really is. Their quarterback is a redshirt sophomore in his first year starting. Gotta imagine your first start being against Penn State, by the way. Their best receiver was the kid that transferred from Kansas State, Corey Sutton. He's the one that had all that controversy with getting out of his letter. That guy is lightning in a bottle if you let him get deep. It's just a very, very young but a very talented football team. So he may have an idea, but there's a lot of kids that he hasn't either gotten a good look at or hasn't seen yet.
You mentioned your first start against Penn State. The first thing that popped into my head, I don't know if it was his first start, but I know that in 1971, Tennessee played Penn State at the end of the year, beat them bad, 31-11. The last touchdown that Penn State scored was an oh-by-the-way one. And I mention all this because they started the quarterback in Tennessee, and I cannot remember his name, but he started as the 4th stringer at the start of the year. And whether it was his first start or not, I'm not 100% sure of, but I mean, it's a similar aspect. I'll just put it that way. And Tennessee won a big rout that day and such. But anyway, let's see. You're talking, what can I say? Evans, the quarterback there, Darrington Evans, that you speak of, going up against. Oh, I'm sorry, Thomas is the quarterback. Forgive me there. Darian Evans is actually, I'm reading the wrong bit right here off of my notes, so I do apologize for that, Steve Behr. Let me change this up then and just ask you, who's going to win the ball game on Thursday that will lead the way to potential riches and potentially the Sun Belt Championship?
Oh, if it were the Georgia Southern of the last two years, I would be solid Appalachian. I'm still going to pick App State, but no more than 7. It could come down to a field goal. I'm just from what I'm reading and seeing from this Georgia Southern team, I think they're kind of turning it around a little bit. And App State has just been playing so well lately. But Georgia Southern sounds like it's got its offense going. I'll take App State, but not in a rout by any stretch.
Let me make a save some face by the Thomas Evans error there. Just want to say this from earlier in there. ETSU and Appalachian State, they actually open up next football season October 31st. Of course, ETSU, we know this was without football 2004 to 2014. I was part of the BFFF, that the organization that helped bring football back, as a matter of fact. But my last question here for you, Steve Behr. I'm hearing a lot of stuff that South Carolina wants to play a 12th game. They had a game canceled because of a hurricane, of course. And one of the teams that is being discussed is actually Appalachian State, because they had a game canceled, and December 1st is open for them. Are you hearing anything about Appalachian State and South Carolina getting together by any chance?
No, but you gave me something to ask them.
All right.
I've not heard that. I think it'd be great. The one thing. One thing that might put the kibosh on that would be if App has to play in the Sun Belt Championship game. I don't think they want to play a Southeastern Conference team and get all banged up and have injury problems going into the championship game. But on the surface, that sounds great. But I really don't think App would go for that just because of that.
It's kind of an intriguing thing right there. Certainly, South Carolina, you know that they probably want an extra victory for their own record to look good instead of 7-4, 8-4, instead of 6-5, 7-5, whatever it is, you know. But it was a speculation that I read from a South Carolina sports writer. Also, he said, well, Central Florida's in there. Who knows? Central Florida wants to try to improve their RPI with a victory against if South Carolina comes on. North Carolina was mentioned. They had a date. So there are a lot of potential suitors, but I was kind of thinking, South Carolina's going to schedule a game. You want to think that they would probably not do it against a major conference opponent. But you have a good point there about the Sun Belt here. Okay, well, we know the quarterback now is at Appalachian State, and we know that they're looking forward. And, yeah, I will say this, the difference between Appalachian State and Georgia Southern, you mentioned they still talk about the Michigan victory whenever an FCS, team beats an FBS game. You're right. They talk about that. They don't necessarily talk about Georgia Southern beating Florida, and that's telling right in that.
That was a huge win. That was, and that I was in the press box at App State when that happened, and they were pulling for it. The people in the press box, they were watching that. They weren't. I didn't hear any tears shed for Florida on that game.
That's when it gets into.
That was terrific. I was laughing the whole time. I thought, good for them.
SEC fans often, they have the reputation of when their team is out, they root for the SEC team to go forward. I can definitely see at Appalachian State, they're going for, hey, these guys will make our conference stronger, that sort of thing. Tri-City Sports Night. Steve Behr, Watauga Democrat, read his story about how they do not like each other, Eagles and Mountaineers, and then you can watch the game on your online devices, ESPNU, ESPN, whatever it is, on Thursday. Yes.
Go down and buy a ticket. Don't be shy.
Tri-City Sports Now coming back after this.